David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So House Democrats yesterday, as we discussed they were about to do, released a resolution to formalize the impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump. So understand that so far they've been pre-interviewing witnesses in private, in accordance with the law, by the way, as I will shortly remind you in the next segment, a very interesting segment upcoming. This is now an impeachment inquiry resolution. The House is expected to vote on it Thursday, and it outlines the process that is going to be taking place to inquire about whether Donald Trump should be impeached by the House of Representatives, ultimately, subsequently to be voted on by the Senate. What does the resolution say? Well, for starters, at its conclusion, the inquiry is going to create a public report of their findings. And this is important in the sense that it is one of the areas that has been heavily criticized by Republicans, that everything is happening, quote, in secret. Well, in reality, nothing has actually happened yet. There's just been pre-interviewing of witnesses. But at the conclusion of this inquiry, there will be a public report that is going to be issued. Now, importantly to Donald Trump, who, as you may know, has been complaining about there's no due process. I'm not getting any due process here, even though we simply didn't get to that point yet. Nothing wrong has happened so far. The resolution outlines the due process that Donald Trump is going to get. And you can make the argument that it's actually generous to Donald Trump. The resolution outlines some new due process rights for the president of the United States. Overall, in a sort of balanced, sober, rational analysis, there's really nothing controversial in the resolution whatsoever. It's very similar to the process that was employed during Bill Clinton's impeachment back in 1998. The difference being that with Bill Clinton, there was this independent counsel report. Remember this guy, Ken Starr, who was brought in to investigate Bill Clinton. There was a report which was presented to the House committees involved by the independent counsel, specifically to the Judiciary Committee. This time, it's a little bit different. The House itself will be doing the investigating, and it will be the entity, the Judiciary Committee will be the entity issuing the full report rather than receiving it from a special prosecutor, independent prosecutor. So now the rubber is sort of going to start meeting the road. And what I mean by that is we're going to see very quickly if Republicans and Donald Trump settle down over there are no guidelines and no due process, because the resolution gives them everything that they've been asking for. Now, of course, there's a chance, call me a skeptic, call me a cynic, there's a chance that it wasn't really about process and guidelines all along. It was just something that Republicans and Trump grasped onto like a last desperate straw to try to stop what it is that is going on. But in any case, if we go by what they've said, Republicans have been asking for their own subpoena power to bring in witnesses. They are being given that by this resolution. Donald Trump has been asking or demanding or complaining about not having due process. He is getting that. We have very clear guidelines here for what this process is going to look like and what the deliverable is going to be. Deliverable, by the way, doesn't have to be a bad word, although when Donald Trump uses it, it often alludes to corruption. The deliverable in this case will be a report, a public report, summarizing the impeachment inquiry. Trump wanted due process, and the resolution gives him that, and it's really important to remember that. The resolution also, by the way, outlines, and this is where it starts to get very interesting, the resolution outlines the possibility of public hearings, which would be just endlessly fascinating. Congressman Jim McGovern, who's a Democrat from Massachusetts, chairman of the Rules Committee, he released the resolution yesterday afternoon. I actually bumped into Jim McGovern over the weekend in Northampton, Massachusetts at the world famous Haymarket Cafe. Very exciting moment for me. He clearly forgot who I was and had no recollection of having met me. But regardless, Jim McGovern releasing for us yesterday the resolution. So prepare yourselves now for just a new wave of bad faith arguments from Republicans about how this is still unfair, how it's still a witch hunt, how it is still a terrible, unfair example of presidential harassment, and also expect the White House to again start moving the bar to come up with new excuses for why they are going to be ignoring and directing everyone under their purview to ignore all subpoenas. Because before it was there's no guidelines, there's no due process, it's an open-ended secret thing that's going on. Now we've been told, here are the guidelines, here is the due process, and there will be a public report after possibly public hearings. They will come up with something new to justify in their minds and in the minds of their supporters why they are going to not cooperate with this inquiry. What I am most looking forward to is that in the resolution, this is just great, it mentions 45 minutes of uninterrupted questioning of witnesses by each side. Democrats would get 45 minutes, and then Republicans would get 45 minutes with witnesses in public testimony. If you've watched congressional testimony before, you probably remember that before there is even a prelude and one question asked, they're low on time because oftentimes each member of the House will get 5 minutes. It's just not enough time. Still, sometimes there are fireworks, but it is not enough time. 45 minutes of uninterrupted questioning of a single witness. The fireworks and the implosions that we could see in 45 minutes of straight questioning could be absolutely glorious. And I am very, very much looking forward to it. And this may be in the end, Republicans shooting themselves in the foot by demanding transparency, because now they have it. And it doesn't look like it's the type of transparency that is going to be particularly good for the narrative that they have been crafting. More upcoming on this, I am sure. I want to hear from you. How do you think the vote will go in the House? Well, the most straightforward prediction is just a straight party line vote. And what do you expect if and when these public impeachment inquiry hearings actually get going? Okay, let's now get into this idea of the narrative that the Trumpists have been crafting around the impeachment inquiry and how it's been going so far, and allegations of illegal secrecy and stuff behind closed doors warranting Republicans barging in on a hearing. We're going to go through all of it. And in fact, this week, we've been doing a lot of media analysis exposing how propaganda cycles work, about how those propaganda cycles are often self-reinforcing like a feedback loop. And there are a lot of examples recently that are really good ones. Some of the examples have been sillier. So earlier this week, we talked about how Fox News covered up the fact that Donald Trump was booed at the World Series by a crowd that was chanting "lock him up" incessantly at Donald Trump. Less important, but still a good example of how the propaganda cycle works. But there is a really serious example that we have to talk about that's taking place, which is not about Trump getting booed and his safe space being pierced. This is an example which potentially could be the difference maker between Donald Trump being reelected compared to Donald Trump being removed from office. Okay, that is how big the stakes are with this example that I'm going to talk about today. And it relates to the constitutionality and the appropriateness of the impeachment inquiry against Donald Trump, because the impeachment inquiry is getting more and more popular, and because it is being formalized as soon potentially as tomorrow by the House of Representatives, as I told you, you are seeing Donald Trump and his followers and his staffers becoming more and more desperate in their attacks against the inquiry itself. And their attempt has been to make the impeachment inquiry appear to be a completely extrajudicial, unconstitutional witch hunt. They've said there's no due process. Well, it's just an inquiry, and the resolution that was just released outlines due process. Due process comes during the actual impeachment if it were to happen. It comes once there is a formal resolution starting an inquiry with public witnesses, so on and so forth. They've said only Democrats are involved in this inquiry. They're keeping Republicans out. Well, remember, number one, the impeachment inquiry, formally speaking, hasn't yet started. But more importantly, after those Republicans stormed a meeting demanding access, we learned that many of those same Republicans are already on committees that are participating in the inquiry and have been questioning witnesses and allowed to review documents. It was a total farce. The latest one, which I want to deal with today, is the idea that because things are happening behind closed doors, something wrong is happening, some major injustice is taking place. The truth is plainly available. And one person who happens to be telling the truth, maybe shockingly, particularly since Shepard Smith has already departed Fox News and he was often his guest, is a former judge and current Fox News legal analyst, Andrew Napolitano, who explained, hold on a second, the impeachment inquiry hearings going on behind closed doors are taking place consistent with the rules of the U.S. House of Representatives. And he is correct. Let's look at the video and then discuss it.
The judge, Andrew Napolitano.
So let me tell you what I did for you, Kilmeade. I read the House rules.
Okay.
And as frustrating as it may be to have these hearings going on behind closed doors, the hearings over which Congressman Schiff is presiding, they are consistent with the rules.
They can make any rules they want.
Well, they can't change the rules. They follow the rules. And when were the rules written? Last? In January of 2015. And who signed them? John Boehner. And who enacted them? A Republican majority.
Now, before we get into the analysis, did you notice what Fox clown Brian Kilmeade did there? When Andrew Napolitano says they're following the rules, the Fox clown says they can make whatever rules they want. And Andrew Napolitano doesn't let him get away with it. He says, no, that's not the point. They, being Democrats, didn't make the rules. Republicans made these rules. These rules were signed into law by a Republican majority. And it is Democrats now who are following those rules. I like how Napolitano does not let Fox clown Brian Kilmeade get away with it. But let's now get to the facts. What we get to is something I said earlier this week. If you do these interviews in public, possible future witnesses can watch the testimony and then repeat the same thing in order to appear as though they are corroborating testimony, and it can potentially distort the investigation. And Napolitano goes on to also address this issue of due process by explaining these aren't the impeachment hearings. Those would be public. These are private hearings to figure out who should even participate in the impeachment hearing.
Secret evidence doesn't work in this world. So eventually there will be a public presentation of this at which lawyers for the president can cross-examine these people and challenge them. This is like presenting a case to a grand jury, which is never done in public. So I get it. The Republicans are frustrated and they wanted to make a point, and they made their point.
They might have made it.
But this is just not the most effective way to show respect for what your colleagues are doing.
I hope that you good people in the audience understand what's going on here. Donald Trump wants you to think that they are impeaching him in secret behind closed doors without due process for unknown reasons on the basis of testimony that will never be made public. That's not happening, okay? What they are doing is what police do when two people might have committed a crime together. You separate the people, you ask them questions separately to see if there are inconsistencies. You ask them to recount what happened without having the privilege of seeing what their potential co-conspirator is saying. Eventually, once the police figure out the case, in a trial, they might question both of those suspects in public as part of the trial. They might question one of them. They might question none of them. This is a choice that law enforcement gets to make. This is like criminal interviewing 101. And Donald Trump is counting on you not knowing that. And realistically, even if you know it, a lot of Donald Trump supporters don't know it, and it's working because among his supporters, there is this contingent of the believe Trump no matter what he says crowd that has fallen for this idea that there is something unconstitutional going on, that there is something extrajudicial going on, that Donald Trump has been in some way denied due process. None of it's true. None of that is going on here. What's happening is not even remotely unusual. Don't fall for it. Don't fall for it. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And coming up very soon this week, don't know exactly when, but soon, maybe tonight, live streams are back on Twitch at twitch.tv/David Pakman. Make sure you're following me there. Make sure you subscribe with Twitch Prime if you are an Amazon Prime member. Quick break, back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Larry Cornwell and Scott Finn. Larry and Scott, thank you so much for being supporters of the David Pakman Show. We do depend primarily on the support of our viewers and listeners who choose To become members, we opened up the books a couple of weeks ago, and I exposed that 40% of our revenue, month to month, a plurality of our revenue, comes from individual memberships like Larry and Scott's. Also want to say thanks to Liam Dotson, who is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Liam has been with us for almost 5 years, and I really, really appreciate your support, Liam. Join these great people at joinpacman.com. It takes under a minute, and you get instant access to all of the great member benefits, including the world-famous bonus show hosted by me Monday through Thursday, hosted by producer Pat on Fridays, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show daily. JoinPacman.com is the place to make it happen. All right, let's get into Hatriot Mail for the week. A quick reminder about Hatriot Mail when a professional voiceover artist does interpretive readings of the hate mail that I receive.
Because thoughts and prayers are bulletproof. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
So this Hatriot Mail actually bummed me out a little bit because even though it's completely unhinged hate, it does have an element of eventual truth in it. Eventual truth. I'll tell you what I mean after we listen to it.
Is Pac-Man ever right about anything? Blah, blah, blah. Shut up, David. Just shut up. You're always fucking wrong, cause you're a liar. You're a paid liar, David. You're a little whiny wah-wah liar. Everyone is sick of you losers. Disgusting. I'm calling to have you canceled and predict your show will soon be gone. From a party whose victimhood's gaslighting.
So listen, I mean, there have been lots of haters who have been predicting that the David Pakman show is on the brink of going off the air any day. And fortunately, so far, they've been wrong. And the program has been growing rather than shrinking. And that's a great thing. But, you know, at some point, some prediction like this is going to be right, isn't it? I mean, nothing lasts forever. If we've learned anything from life and following politics, where am I going with this? I don't know. If we've learned anything, it's that impermanence is the only predictable thing in life. I guess as well as death and taxes or something like that. So at a certain point, I hate to admit it, a Hatriot will write in and say, your show is going off the air soon, and they will eventually be right. A sad thought for us, but not today. Not today. And the best way to fight Hatriotism is to sign up for a membership at joinpacman.com. Using the coupon code Hatriot40, you save 40%. Hatriots cry that their flailing attempts to destroy the show are only growing support for the show. And that coupon code is spelled HATRIOT40. It'll save you 40% off of any membership at joinpacman.com. From the first moment that we learned of the existence of a whistleblower around the Trump-Ukraine phone call corruption bribery fiasco, I told you on day one, Donald Trump or people around him will figure out who the whistleblower is. And if they do, they will figure out a way to leak the name of the whistleblower, putting them in obvious and immediate danger. And now we've learned that they've done it. There's a guy who now works for horrible, extremist, extremely depraved Republican Congressman Devin Nunes, who previously worked as an advisor to Donald Trump, who leaked documents that identify the whistleblower's name. The aide's name is Derek Harvey. He gave notes to House Republicans outing the whistleblower, the goal, of course, being get the name in the record of the proceedings in the House Intelligence Committee, because Adam Schiff said that eventually those records would be made public as part of a report on the Trump impeachment inquiry. We've also learned from the Washington Post that Republicans have been using the whistleblower's alleged name multiple times during these private depositions, meaning it is working. And it is working because they do not care that it puts this whistleblower's life at risk. Mark Zaid is the attorney for the whistleblower. And Mark Zaid says that his client's life is at risk if his name gets out, that the lives of the whistleblower's family are at risk if their name gets out, or if the name of the whistleblower gets out, saying, quote, exposing the identity of the whistleblower and attacking our client would do nothing to undercut the validity of the complaint's allegations. What it would do, however, is put that individual and their family at risk of harm. Perhaps more important, it would deter future whistleblowers from coming forward in subsequent administrations, Democratic or Republican. Well, yeah, that's the point. Stop future whistleblowers, put this whistleblower's life at risk in order to ruin their life. And this has led to some far-right news outlets like OANN, One American News Network, and the Gateway Pundit to start publishing a name that they claim is the name of the whistleblower. Notice that I'm not saying what that name is. So understand the sick nature of this. The claims of the whistleblower have already been corroborated, even by people in the Trump administration, wittingly or unwittingly. If you ask them, they might not agree they've corroborated the claims, but they've corroborated the claims. They put out this phone call transcript, which is not a transcript, but they call it a summary. It's really just a couple of excerpts of the transcript. And it is already damning to Trump with ellipses and redactions. It's still extraordinarily damning to Trump, further incriminating Donald Trump in this entire fiasco. Donald Trump panics and starts tweeting all sorts of ridiculous things, but then they still want to ruin the whistleblower's life because this is just how they operate. Tell me that what Derek Harvey did, feeding a name to Republicans in this way, is a prosecutable offense. I don't know if it is. I've got a couple of emails out to attorney friends. This is sort of out of their area of expertise. They're looking for an answer for me. I don't know the answer. Is it a prosecutable offense, what Derek Harvey has done? If you have a sense of that, let me know. Isn't this closer to the treason that the right claims the whistleblower has done than anything the whistleblower has actually done? Aren't we supposed to be protecting whistleblowers? Isn't that one of those things that is supposed to cross party lines to the extent that we still cross party lines in American politics? And we are supposed to protect whistleblowers? I guess not. The president isn't even doing it. Is this obstruction? Is this witness intimidation in a sense? Aren't we supposedly about the rule of law under the Trump administration? The answer is no. That stuff only matters when it's convenient. When it's not, it all goes out the window. And further, I know I've mentioned this before, but just to give you the full scope of this, there is a double standard in American politics when it comes to whistleblowers and leakers. And the left is guilty of this as well. Although right now we're talking about the right putting the whistleblower's life at stake, life at risk, which is something different altogether. But we see this in American politics a lot. There's a whistleblower or a leak or whatever, and some information goes public. If your side likes the content that has gone public, you ignore how we got it and you focus only on the content. If your side doesn't like the content, you ignore the implications of the content and focus only on the fact that there is a whistleblower, that it was leaked, that information in some cases was stolen or whatever the case may be. This is a status quo in American politics. That being said, Republicans are going way further. Republicans are actually working to put the whistleblower's life at risk and the lives of the whistleblower's family at risk. I'm not going to participate in that. I'm not naming the whistleblower. Eventually, we may know who the person is, and it may simply become part of the record. And at that point, okay, we will revisit. But for now, I'm not going to participate in this. Make sure you're following The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. We've got some great stuff going on there. And make sure you follow me on Instagram as well. Don't forget about me, guys. David.Pakman on Instagram. We'll be back right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Kade Crockford, who's the director of the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Kade, great to have you on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk about biometric surveillance, facial recognition, and how law enforcement may or can use these technologies. But first, recently on the program, I had someone call in and talk about, hey, David, hasn't what we mean by a right to privacy been drastically altered by the technologies that exist today, in the sense that 100 years ago in public, legally, you might have had a very similar a set of rights and laws as you have today, But in practice, a lot of the technologies that exist today and didn't 100 years ago have changed what it means to be anonymous or to be in private or in public. What should our understanding of this be under the law, but then also kind of a more colloquial understanding?
That's a great question. People need to remember that in a democracy, and our society is ostensibly a democracy, we, the people, are in charge, not corporations or government agencies like the FBI. So we have the power, at least theoretically, to determine how new technologies ought to impact our right to privacy, to anonymity, even in public space. So I just want to remind folks that the Constitution, the way that it's interpreted by the courts, is merely a floor. It is not a ceiling. So in other words, we could certainly, if we wanted to, pass laws prohibiting corporations from selling our cell site location information. That's the information revealing where we've been, where we've traveled with our cell phones in the past. We could do that. It just requires a political will. We certainly could prohibit or severely restrict the government from using technologies like facial recognition in public space. That's merely a political problem. It's not a technological problem. So certainly technology has changed the degree to which both corporations and governments can create really comprehensive records of our movements, our activities, our associations, our interests. But that's not necessarily inevitable. It is merely because we have not taken the necessary political steps to ensure that our technology does not outpace the law with respect to our privacy protections.
And when we start to look at the ways in which law enforcement use or utilize some of these technologies, we've talked about everything from I believe they're called Stingray, a cell tower, sort of replicators. I may be lacking the exact right vocabulary, but the idea that the police can have a device that your cell phone will believe is just another cell tower and connect to it. And by virtue of that, you are passing a lot of information on to law enforcement, biometric surveillance, facial recognition software. We're going to get into some of these specifics and where they're being used, but what is the position of the ACLU, generally speaking, about law enforcement's ability to use these different technologies when a warrant does not exist for the specific surveillance of an individual?
So just as a general matter, the Fourth Amendment provides for our right to privacy and says essentially that unless you're involved in criminal activity and the government can show evidence of that, which is called probable cause, to a judge and get a warrant, they shouldn't be able to invade your privacy. Now, as we kind of discussed before, there's an active debate about what privacy means in the 21st century. So just as an example, a recent Supreme Court case that was decided in the summer of 2018, last summer, called Carpenter versus United States, is the most important privacy ruling we've seen at the Supreme Court in a long time. And that case is particularly important because it disagreed with law enforcement's interpretation of the Fourth Amendment, which essentially was that when you go out in public, you have no right to privacy. So the court held in a very important ruling, in the Carpenter ruling, in a decision written by Chief Justice Roberts, that in fact, technology has substantially changed the balance of power between the government and the people. Now, in a free society, in a democracy, the government ought to know almost nothing about the general population unless we've affirmatively disclosed information to the government to receive benefits or something like that. And we should know almost everything about what the government is doing. New surveillance technologies, and unfortunately the post 9/11 hysteria around terrorism, has really flipped that balance. So now the government, and this is true of even local and state police officers, all the way up to the level of the federal government at the FBI and the DEA, et cetera, they can know almost everything about us, often without a warrant. And we know very little about what they're doing because their operations are shrouded in secrecy. So the Carpenter ruling is really important because it stakes a very clear claim, or rather draws a line in the sand for 21st century forms of surveillance by essentially saying it is vastly different for law enforcement to use technology like cell phone tracking, technologies like cell site location information that is maintained on hundreds of millions of people across the United States. That is qualitatively and quantitatively different from law enforcement following one person around to see where they're going. And this is an important concept that we call friction, right? There are only so many police officers in the US. I think there are too many. There are about 1 million. But there are over 300 million people in this country, right? And so it would be physically impossible for law enforcement to follow each one of us around, noting our every movement every day of our lives. Cell phone technology makes it possible not only for law enforcement to see where we are in the present moment and on a mass scale, but also to do something that was previously impossible, which is to find out where we were 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago, 6 months ago, before we were even under a criminal investigation or suspected of a crime. And so Chief Justice Roberts says that because the technology facilitates a new form of mass tracking that is not possible without the technology, the government is required to get a warrant, even if they are merely tracking our public movements, even if they're not tracking our private movements in our home, even if they're just tracking where we go on public streets, because previous to the existence of this technology, that type of surveillance was actually not even feasible. So yes, mass surveillance is distinct from individualized, targeted surveillance that law enforcement is engaged in because they believe that someone is actually engaged in a crime. New technologies, license plate readers, face surveillance technology, certainly cell phone tracking, give the government the power to very cheaply conduct surveillance of hundreds of millions of people's movements and activities. And again, not just in the present moment, but actually reversing back in time to see what we've been doing days, weeks, or months before.
So let's now dig in a little bit to the specifics of how some of these technologies are being implemented. Different types of biometric surveillance and facial recognition. Where is it currently being used? So
there's a lot we don't know, unfortunately, especially about what the federal government is doing with face surveillance technology. Remote biometric tracking technologies we view as distinct from the traditional forms of biometric surveillance that the government has conducted, including fingerprints and DNA.
Right.
And the reason that iris scanning, gait scanning, so that's the way that you walk, is also a biometric, which just means something that's unique to each individual. Of course, our faces. There's even some science that says the shape of our ears is a biometric. So these new forms of biometrics that the FBI has been experimenting with for years now, and that state and local law enforcement are beginning to use to track and identify people, those are distinct from fingerprints and DNA for one simple reason. And we need to think of them as a class as uniquely dangerous for this reason. It is necessary. Again, this is back to the concept of friction. If law enforcement wants to get my fingerprints or my DNA, they actually have to send someone physically to follow me, to pick up my coffee cup or my cigarette butt when I've thrown it on the ground or in the trash, to test that material, that physical material. It is not possible yet, maybe it will be someday, but it's not possible yet to pluck someone's DNA from a camera that is coming from a satellite in space. It is easy, trivial, actually, and it's going to become even easier for governments and corporations to collect and store our biometrics like our iris, our face, our ears, the way that we walk, our gait, remotely and therefore en masse. Again, this concept of friction is really important. You can't have 1 million police officers collecting 300 million people's DNA. It's simply impractical. You can very easily, in the kind of China-style surveillance system that we're seeing in certain regions of that country, set up camera networks that facilitate the mass tracking of people through their biometrics that are detectable remotely. So how is this happening? Again, we're not sure what's going on at the federal level. The FBI is very secretive. Congress has asked a lot of questions that have gone unanswered of the FBI. We aim to find out. We filed a public records request in January against the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Administration, asking them for information about how they use these technologies. We're particularly concerned about in the absence of any regulation, the FBI using these technologies to track and monitor dissidents at protests and places like Standing Rock, climate, racial justice, anti-war, anti-Trump types of activists. And we do know, however, that the FBI has access to 640 million images of adults in the United States. So that's more, obviously, than every adult in the country. So essentially every single person with a state identification card, every person who's been arrested is in a database that's accessible to the FBI for facial surveillance purposes. That's pretty terrifying, and Congress has thus far done nothing to stop it. We also know that at the local level, like, for example, here in Massachusetts, the driver's license state ID database maintained by the Registry of Motor Vehicles is basically a perpetual lineup for law enforcement face surveillance searches. So we know that since 2006, state and local and federal law enforcement have been using that database to conduct maybe phishing expeditions, pulling images from Facebook when they want to identify someone and running it against the RMV's database using facial recognition technology to try to identify people. That's been happening without any judicial oversight, with no legislative authorization, no probable cause or even reasonable suspicion is required by police. They don't have to demonstrate that anybody's involved in a crime before they can perform one of these searches. And so we're very concerned that in the absence of any oversight or accountability at the state level, these systems are being abused and misused currently.
Yeah, I mean, anytime when I'm hearing about any policy and someone presents a very black and white view, my instinct is to be skeptical of that, because like with most things, there are sort of things on both sides of the ledger. So if we step back for a moment from the legality, I could imagine that on the one hand, this is technology that can be used to not only invade people's privacy in cases when they actually haven't done anything wrong, but also misidentify people. It might disproportionately be inaccurate with people from certain races, gender. I mean, who knows, right? There's all sorts of things on the bad side of the ledger. On the other hand, there are probably some ways in which this technology can lead to speedier resolution of a crime or more quickly finding a potential a violent person or whatever. It's all hypothetical. But then we get to what you're talking about, which is this seems to go beyond some of the basic tenets of how law enforcement is supposed to operate based on the rules that have been established with regard to warrants and probable cause and how investigations have to be done. And that's where I feel like the concern goes beyond merely evaluating whether the ends are worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, in my view, there are three distinct ways that this technology can be used. One is to, as I said before, perform an identification of someone. So say there's a dead person, right? Law enforcement finds somebody dead in a ditch. They don't know who this person is. They're not carrying any identification. They run the fingerprints. The person's never been arrested. They're not, identifiable that way. Facial recognition could be a valuable tool in that case, right? You take a picture of the person's face, you run it against a database like the Registry of Motor Vehicles to try to find out who is this dead body. There's a second way that the technology can be used, which is vastly different, which is to supercharge effectively all of the surveillance camera networks that exist in our cities and towns across the United States with automation technology that makes it possible to, in the future, the technology is not really there yet. It doesn't quite work, but it will get better. And in the future, the technology may enable government agencies to type in your name, David Parkman, hit enter, and then automatically the software will stitch together a video showing every single place you've been over the past 5-10 years, however long the video is stored, who you were with, what you were doing, and prepare a nice little report. David Parkman was seen outside the cannabis shop on this date. He was seen outside the Planned Parenthood on this date. He was seen at a mosque on this date. He was seen at a protest on this date. He was seen with a whistleblower on this date, right? So that type of surveillance is the stuff that we're actually the most concerned about, and we think has no place in a democratic society. That is actually something that should just be banned permanently. We should never allow government agencies to create architectures of surveillance that facilitate that kind of mass tracking of people in public space. It has no place in a free society. There's a third way, which is also very scary, which is facial analysis technology. So this is technology that purports to be able to discern whether someone is happy or sad or anxious or stressed by evaluating their face. Now, a lot of it's junk science. A really important research paper was published by scholars at Northeastern University, including Dr. Lisa Barrett, who's a world-renowned psychologist. She reviewed over 2,000 papers in this area and found essentially that due to cultural differences, people with autism, et cetera, people depending on the moods that they're in and different contexts, it is actually not possible to discern how someone is feeling by evaluating the physical characteristics of their face. So we are very concerned that law enforcement, other government agencies will start to adopt technologies that purport to be able to tell police officers, potentially in a very high stress, dangerous situation, whether the person that they're looking at is stressed, has a criminal record, and may be armed and dangerous. And if the technology gets stuff wrong in that kind of context, which we assume it will, because technology frequently gets things wrong, that could mean the difference between life and death for a human being walking on the streets of an American city. And so we want to make sure, again, that those types of facial analysis tools that are already in relatively widespread use in the commercial sector. So, for example, in remote job interviews, they're doing these they're using these technologies over technologies like Skype when you're applying for a job at a large corporation. We want to make sure that government agencies are not using those technologies to evaluate, for example, in the interrogation room, whether someone's telling the truth or not when they're talking to the police. So there are two categories of the technology that we actually think should never be adopted in a free society. The other, we have an image of someone's face and we want to identify this person. I think that, for example, with dead people, potentially with Alzheimer's patients, and potentially in very, very, specific criminal investigations where there's a really high risk to the public, like, for example, in a murder investigation, with the appropriate level of judicial oversight and transparency and, rigorous auditing and public oversight, that type of surveillance may have a place in the 21st century. But there are some forms, again, that really just shouldn't. And we have the power, again, in a democracy to draw that line and say, you know what? Amazon and Jeff Bezos have a certain idea of what the future ought to look like. We have a different one, and we're going to make sure that ours wins out.
We've been speaking with Kade Crockford, who's the director of the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Kade, thanks so much for talking to us about this today.
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
This next story is sort of a cross between sad, hilarious, but also disturbingly emblematic of the absolute absurdity, not just of this administration, but of the last 7 days in Trumplandia. Our fearless orange leader, in the middle of an impeachment inquiry going formal, of being booed and shouted "lock him up" at during a World Series game, and his staged post-ISIS raid photo op has been reduced to tweeting pictures of dogs, to put it lightly, with inaccurate claims about the dog. Take a look at this. Quote, "We have declassified a picture of the wonderful dog, name not declassified, that did such a great job in capturing and killing the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi." So first of all, is there anything more cringeworthy than continuing to tout in the most bizarre way possible this raid over the weekend as if it was Donald Trump's doing? But then maybe more importantly, the dog did a good job capturing and killing al-Baghdadi. Al-Baghdadi died by suicide at his own doing, using a suicide vest that he was wearing, killing 3 of his own children in so doing. What on earth is going on here? And there's actually a lot of sort of weird dog-related imagery, literal and metaphorical. Donald Trump not only tweeting pictures of dogs related to the al-Baghdadi raid, but remember that Donald Trump used the word dog multiple times during his big speech announcing the death of al-Baghdadi to denigrate people, calling them dogs. When I saw this tweet, what maybe struck me most viscerally was that there's a realization I had, I guess, that Donald Trump could never have a dog because he just doesn't really care about other beings in the way you have to properly care for a dog. And this really is just a lead up to the bigger story of all the lies that Donald Trump has been telling about the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which I'm going to get into next. But let me remind you, when I think this bears repeating, earlier this week, I showed you a tweet, I believe it was on Monday, where Donald Trump back in 2012 said, listen, why are we criticizing, why are we praising Barack Obama so much for the killing of Osama bin Laden? It was our service members who did it. Let's stop praising Barack Obama because Barack Obama didn't do it. That same tweet basically tells you everything you need to know about what is going on this week, and much the same way that when the Barr letter was released in advance of the Mueller report several months ago, Donald Trump used the Barr letter to justify a national exoneration and vindication tour, which of course was completely and absolutely bogus, but it worked. Donald Trump is similarly using this raid against al-Baghdadi to justify his own existence, essentially, and to pat himself on the back in ways that are completely beyond what the facts dictate. Now, in the next segment, I'm going to get to what level of credit does Donald Trump deserve for this. But first, let's review the lies that Donald Trump has been telling. Okay, this is very serious. Donald Trump is just making stuff up about the raid that led to the death by suicide of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Donald Trump has told a whole bunch of different lies about it, specific ones, general lies like lie by implication, where Donald Trump was golfing at the time of the raid, but later staged a picture in the Situation Room about 95 minutes later to make it seem as though he was there squinting in the way that I really only have seen Donald Trump do, which I think he thinks makes him look strong. There have been all sorts of different lies and deceptions. But Donald Trump also, aside from barely being able to pronounce Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's name during that post-raid speech that he gave, he said some things that are leaving Trump administration officials wondering, where the hell did Donald Trump get that? Let's take a look at the video.
Last night, the United States brought the world's #1 terrorist leader to justice. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead. No personnel were lost in the operation, while a large number of Baghdadi's fighters and companions were killed with him. He died after running into a dead-end tunnel, whimpering and crying and screaming all the way. The compound had been cleared by this time, with people either surrendering or being shot and killed. 11 young children were moved out of the house and are uninjured. The only ones remaining were Baghdadi in the tunnel, and he had dragged 3 of his young children with him. They were led to certain death. He reached the end of the tunnel as our dogs chased him down. He ignited his vest, killing himself and the 3 children. His body was mutilated by the blast. The tunnel had caved in on it in addition. But test results gave certain, immediate, and totally positive identification. It was him.
There's a lot there that Trump administration officials have no idea where Trump got it. Donald Trump says that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi died whimpering, crying, and screaming. Donald Trump was not given audio of the incident. We now know that Donald Trump had overhead surveillance footage without audio. How does he know that al-Baghdadi was whimpering, crying, and screaming, despite the fact that Trump had no audio and it allegedly took place in a tunnel and Trump had overhead video? Well, the answer is he doesn't know that. It's a lie. It is just a straight up bold-faced lie. And immediately when Donald Trump said this, staffers started messaging each other asking, where did Donald Trump get this about whimpering, crying, and screaming? Nobody knew. So then Donald Trump was asked about it, and he just insisted he's telling the truth. But these are lies. Donald Trump saying he doesn't want to talk about it, but then repeats the exact same lies.
On your video hookup, mentioned the whimpering of Baghdadi.
I don't want to talk about it, but he was screaming, crying, and whimpering. And he was scared out of his mind. And think of James Foley. Think of Kayla. Think of the things he did to Kayla. What he did to Foley and so many others. And for those people that say, oh, isn't this a little violent? Think of how many times have you seen men, I think in all cases men for the most part, but in terms of this, where you see the orange suits.
You don't want to talk about it, but then you repeat the same lies. Then Donald Trump goes off into other tangents after repeating the same lie to sort of try to change the subject. This is a reality of Donald Trump's own construction that exists only in the mind of Donald Trump. Reporters went to the Pentagon to try to confirm some of this. The Pentagon said, we don't have those details, and they shut their mouths. The next day, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, I don't have that information. Maybe Donald Trump has other information. Check it out.
President Trump described yesterday Baghdadi whimpering and crying before he died. Can you elaborate or confirm those details?
Secretary was asked the same question yesterday. I know the president had planned to talk down to the unit and unit members, but I don't know what the source of that was there, but I assume it was talking directly to unit and unit members.
Yep, I have no idea where Donald Trump got that, but I don't know. I guess he must have talked to someone. So it's really important that we on the left take a rational, balanced approach on this issue. ISIS is horrible. They are terrorists. Losing their leader hurts ISIS to some degree. That's good. This was not a good person. The world is better off with this person not alive. And to some degree, even if temporarily, it damages ISIS. Now, that being said, Donald Trump is, number one, overstating his role in this entire thing. Number two, was golfing at the time, but later staged a picture of himself in the Situation Room. That is a form of lying. Number three, Trump is overstating the importance of killing one leader when you really aren't doing anything to root out the ideology that inspires the terrorists. And in fact, you may further inspire more people to become radicalized merely by killing someone putatively or ostensibly known as the leader of the organization. And number four, we learned that he's also lying about details, like claiming that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was whimpering, crying, and screaming, something that Donald Trump couldn't have possibly known, and that no one is willing to corroborate. This is not how we should be operating. Even mixed in with the accomplishments that are implicit in taking out the leader of such a terrible terrorist organization, the way that this is being handled is riddled with embarrassment the world over. Even Trump's own staffers are saying, yeah, we don't know where he's coming up with this stuff. It is yet another one of these horrible, toxic embarrassments. And there was a very interesting video done yesterday that compared and contrasted the way Barack Obama handled the killing of Osama bin Laden compared with how Donald Trump has handled the death by suicide of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And it's not about, every president does things, particularly in foreign policy, that progressives would be against. That's no different with Barack Obama, the drone policy. We've got a long list of stuff. But after being desensitized to Trump for almost 3 years now, to go back and see how a normal person handled the killing of a terrorist and to compare it to Trump, it's stunning how far we've fallen. And to call it anything other than depressing seems to be sort of missing the most prominent feeling that I'm experiencing when I see this stuff. Let's go to our voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. You can call any time of day, and many people do call very, very late at night or early in the morning, depending on what your life schedule is. Here is someone who is not pleased with my pronunciation of a particular presidential candidate's name. Take a listen.
David, how's it going, man? This is Michael from Missouri.
Right.
I want to tell you something. I'm a little peeved with you about you pronouncing someone's name wrong on the show. I think it's on purpose, and I think it's very disingenuous of you. I think you know who I'm talking about. Today you pronounced her name Tulsi Gabbard, I think not. It's clearly Tulsi Gabbard. Okay? I'm very angry with you. You need to start pronouncing your name right, or else I'm going to keep calling in about this.
Well, listen, I stand corrected. As I've mentioned before, English is my second language. I did not learn English as a baby because it's what I heard around me. My parents did not speak English to me when I was a kid because I didn't live in the United States. I lived in a Spanish-speaking country. So there are, it happens quite a bit that people write in and they say, David, you're not pronouncing this correctly, you're not pronouncing that correctly. Sometimes I don't know how people pronounce their names, so I stand corrected, and I do apologize to anyone that was offended by anything that I've ever said on the program. I will even go further. If I've ever offended anyone with something I've said on the program, I apologize to you unquestionably and unflinchingly with absolutely no preconditions whatsoever. We've got a great bonus show for you today. The NCAA has taken a major step to allow student athletes to be compensated sort of while they are college athletes, not for the athletics themselves, but for their likeness. We will talk about that. We will talk about a taco truck that served ICE workers, then apologized, and then apologized again. And we will also talk about the U.S. House of Representatives voting to recognize the Armenian genocide, a story of much interest to many in our audience, interestingly. Got a bunch of emails about it. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Become a member at joinpacman.com to get instant access, or become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. We will speak to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.